Okay, in the non-profit sector, okay, we've just been talking about, your views about how people need to start thinking about things perhaps in a sort of different way. What would your advice be to the leaders of big organizations and non-profit sector in terms of how they should start looking differently at things?
Yeah, great question. First of all, in terms of my work with nonprofit versus for-profit, one real difference, and this is just from the leadership standpoint, so executives that I meet, that very, very mission-driven. So I know that seems obvious, but I think that comes into play a bit. So there's not this pressure for example, for-profit organizations, what's the next sell? What's going to be the my quarterly profits that I have to report to the street or whatever. So there's not those constraints, which I think is good. However, I do find, especially organizations, nonprofit organizations that have been in existence for a long time, they are almost even more embedded in the ways of doing things that they've been doing things in the past. So in other words, that concept of we rely on our experiences from the past seem to be even stronger. So number one, I would work very hard on explicitly talking about how can we bring people in that will give us a different frame, that will give us a different sort of focus than just people that have only worked in nonprofit, multi-level organizations. Clearly mission-driven, wonderful executives, but it's easy to fall into that trap. So that's one thing that I've seen. The second, and this is actually not specific to nonprofit, but this concept of let's identify our key uncertainties. Let's not hide from that, but rather say what are our key uncertainties, and really and truly get people speaking the language of, hey, what weak signals are we hearing? What are we seeing, in articles that we read, in the for-profit sector and the not-for-profit sector? So I think it's that, and that's generic across organizations. What are your key uncertainties? And instead of saying, let's mitigate the risk, let's try to capture what those weak signals are.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing is, I suppose, if you're worried about your share price and worried about those quarters, as you pointed out, obviously, that gives you a great sense of urgency. Is there perhaps a lack of urgency
well,
in the other
that's a fair
sense?
point, actually. Yeah, it does give you a sense of urgency. What I find is, and again, this is a very big distinction, is that for-profit companies, the biggest struggle is to getting people to think long-term. So I may be running a business in one of these big, huge conglomerates, but I'm still worried about what I'm bringing to the bottom line for the next report that's coming out. And so there is that sense of urgency, but maybe not so much on the long term. So that's the difference I see. And I think that multilateral, they're great at the long term. It's maybe is harder to put something into action.
Yeah. And the other question I have for you, since this is a gathering of human resource professionals, is where do they fit in? Are they supposed to lead the charge or support the charge?
So I actually believe that if it's possible within the organization, it's great if they can lead the charge, because I think that HR or talent management uniquely positioned to cut across the organization. They are the folks that absolutely have touching every single one of the businesses in a way to understand what kind of leadership skills are needed, what are the competencies, let's build succession plans and build the right people. So if the organization allows, I think human resources is the perfect department or part of the organizations to lead this, no question. I recognize that some organizations don't have that emphasis on the people aspect of the business, and I think that we'll continue to see evidence that organizations that don't pay attention to that don't have good long-term sustainability.
Okay, good. Kathy, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.